I need you to come get me. Ilara Vance's voice was a trembling whisper into her phone, pressed close in the suffocating dark of her own apartment. Her world was silence and unseen threats. On the other side of the wall, her reclusive billionaire neighbor, Atlas Kane, heard every desperate word. He lived in a fortress of wealth and silence, but tonight, the sound of exploitation, the systematic theft of a life from a blind woman by her own court-appointed guardian, became impossible to ignore. What happened next was a private war waged from a penthouse, a campaign of ruthless justice that would shatter a perfectly constructed prison. Ilara Vance was a gifted pianist before a rare disease stole her sight and her independence. Now, under the control of a court-appointed guardian, her world had shrunk to a single apartment, while her trust fund and dignity were systematically drained. Atlas Kane, the man in the penthouse next door, had withdrawn from the world after a personal tragedy, his fortune a fortress against human connection. But when he heard the truth through the wall, a calculated cruelty disguised as care, one question became unavoidable. What happens when a man who can buy anything decides the only thing worth having is justice? The system that was meant to protect Ilara placed her under the guardianship of Diane Riggs, a woman who specialized in complicated estates. On paper, it was logical. Ilara's degenerative condition, Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, had progressed rapidly. She had no immediate family. A professional guardian would manage her medical care and a trust fund left by her grandmother, worth just over $2 million. But within a year, Ilara's world had been reduced to 4 walls. Atlas Kane heard the construction first. The thin walls of the upscale but poorly built luxury tower carried every sound. For months after moving in, he'd heard nothing from next door. Then came the drilling, the installation of new heavy locks on Ilara's door from the outside, the replacement of her smart home system with a basic intercom. Each change was a step in a methodical isolation. Atlas was a ghost in his own penthouse. His fortune, built on predictive analytics and brutal market bets, had insulated him from human contact after the death of his sister. His only connection to the building was through encrypted memos to the building manager. He preferred it that way, until the silence from next door was replaced by something worse: controlled, systematic neglect. He began to piece it together through accidental eavesdropping. The guardian, Diane, visited every Tuesday and Friday. Her voice was a clipped, efficient instrument. Atlas heard the conversations through the ventilation shaft, discussions about budgetary adjustments to Ilara's care, the cancellation of her tactile music lessons, the switch to cheaper, pre-made meals. Ilara's voice, once melodic with despair, became flatter, smaller. Then came the phone call he wasn't meant to hear. Ilara, thinking she was alone, whispered to an old friend. "She sold the Steinway," Ilara said, the tears audible in her breath. "She said it was a tripping hazard, that the insurance was too high. It was my mother's. It was how I could still feel the music." The friend, clearly alarmed, urged her to contact the court. Ilara's response was a lesson in terror. "I can't. Diane reviews all my mail. She monitors my calls. She said if I caused trouble, she'd petition for a transfer to a managed care facility. I can't go to a home, Sarah. I'd rather die here." Atlas stood frozen in his kitchen, a glass of water in hand. This wasn't just petty theft or neglect. This was the strategic dismantling of a person, a carousel of assets being liquidated under the guise of safety. And it was all perfectly legal, wrapped in the imposing authority of a court order. He made his first discreet inquiry that day, not through his usual channels, but through a private cybersecurity firm on his payroll. He gave them a single name, Diane Riggs. What came back 48 hours later was not a smoking gun, but a pattern. Riggs was the sole guardian for 7 other vulnerable adults. Public records showed she had petitioned for the sale of major assets from 4 of those estates in the past 2 years. A vintage car collection from a man with dementia, a coastal property from a stroke survivor, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks from an elderly woman with Parkinson's. The fees, all approved by the probate court, were at the absolute maximum allowed by statute. But the real money seemed to be in the asset liquidation, handled by a specific appraiser and realty company that appeared again and again in the paperwork. It had the faint, greasy smell of a kickback scheme, but it was buried under layers of procedural legitimacy. Atlas faced a wall of legal privilege. The guardianship court operated in a realm of protected privacy, its hearings often closed, its records sealed to protect the ward. To the system, he was a stranger with no standing, a billionaire with no more right to intervene than a man on the street. But Atlas Kane had built an empire on seeing patterns in chaos that others missed, and he saw one here. The system's greatest strength, its protective secrecy, was also its fatal flaw. It was designed to keep outsiders from interfering. It never anticipated an outsider with the resources to become an insider. He needed evidence that couldn't be ignored, not by a court but by the world. He needed to give Ilara a voice that could shatter glass. His first move was technological. His team, working remotely, cloned the building's outdated security server. They gained access to the digital log for the 8th floor, every keycard entry, every door alarm. The data painted a damning picture of isolation. Diane Riggs's visits had dropped from twice a week to once, never staying more than 20 minutes. The grocery delivery service had been cancelled. The only consistent entries were for a cleaning service that came bi-weekly, always coinciding with Diane's visits, a performative cleanliness for the Guardian's eyes. The physical evidence was next. Atlas instructed his building manager to schedule mandatory fire alarm testing for every unit. When the technician arrived at Ilara's door, Atlas watched from his peephole. Diane Riggs answered, blocking the doorway. She refused entry, citing Ilara's fragile health. The technician, confused, left. Atlas's manager, prepped for this, insisted it was a city code violation. A tense exchange followed. Finally, Riggs relented, but only after she had first gone inside for several minutes. When the tech entered, Atlas's hidden camera in the hallway caught a glimpse. The apartment was stark, bare walls, a single chair, no radio, no books in Braille, a prison cell dressed as a luxury apartment. But here's the thing about perfect crimes. They require perfect control, and Diane Riggs made her first mistake. She got greedy. Atlas's financial forensic team, tracing the public shells of the companies that bought the sold assets, found a loop. A real estate LLC that purchased Ilara's late grandmother's vacant lot at a 60% discount had a silent partner. The partner's name was hidden behind a Cayman Islands trust, but the payment trail, like a single strand of spider silk, led back to a shell company whose incorporator was Diane Riggs's brother-in-law. It was a thread, the first tangible proof of self-dealing, but it wasn't enough. To pull on, it would alert Riggs, giving her time to bury the evidence deeper and possibly retaliate against Ilara. Atlas needed something immediate, something that would force the system to look. He needed Riggs to betray her own protocol. He engineered the scenario. Using a spoofed number and a voice modulator, his team called Diane Riggs, posing as a clerk from the probate court, announcing an unannounced audit of her ward's living conditions in 72 hours. It was a bluff, but a credible one. Panic is a predictable architect. Atlas watched the surveillance feed in real time. Riggs arrived at the building within the hour, her calm facade cracked. She brought 2 men from the cleaning service, but they carried in boxes, not cleaning supplies, new pillows, a cheap print for the wall, a small radio. They were staging a home. As they worked, Riggs argued on her phone in the hallway, her voice a sharp hiss. Atlas's parabolic microphone picked up. "I don't care what it costs, just get the paperwork filed tomorrow. The Vance girls' medical reports need to show rapid decline. We need to justify the increased care fees and the pending property sale. If this audit sniffs around, I want everything pointing toward terminal transition." Atlas felt a cold fury settle in his veins. They weren't just stealing from Ilara, they were fabricating a medical pretext to drain the last of her estate, likely before transferring her to a state facility. The clock was no longer about gathering evidence. It was about preventing an irreversible act. He had the proof of motive, the evidence of fraud, and the recording of a conspiracy to commit medical fraud. But taking it to the authorities meant wading into the very system that had empowered Riggs. The risk was unthinkable. If he moved wrong, Ilara would disappear into the machinery of protective custody, and his evidence might be ruled inadmissible, the fruit of illegal surveillance. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights twinkling like indifferent stars. The reclusive billionaire had 2 choices: walk away, and let the crime he could now prove continue in the dark, or step into the light and use every weapon at his disposal to burn the whole corrupt operation down, knowing it would drag him back into a world of headlines and scrutiny he had vowed to avoid. He made his decision. He picked up a secure, untraceable phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 5 years. It rang twice before a wary voice answered. "Kane, this line was for emergencies." Atlas's voice was low, final. "It is one, I need a team, the kind that doesn't file paperwork, and I need a journalist who can't be bought. We're not going to court." He paused, looking at the shared wall. "We're going to war." The team Atlas Kane assembled in 48 hours operated in the gray spaces where the law lagged behind justice. There was Leo, a former forensic accountant for the Securities and Exchange Commission who'd quit over a buried case. Maria, a security specialist whose expertise was in extracting people from hostile situations, not physically, but digitally and legally. And the journalist, Naomi Vance, no relation to Ilara, but a Pulitzer finalist known for taking down corrupt institutions. She was the public sledgehammer. Atlas would be the silent scalpel. Their strategy was twofold. First, protect the victim. Second, expose the crime in a way that couldn't be buried. But to protect Ilara, they needed to reach her directly, to bypass the Guardian's control. This was the first major hurdle. Diane Riggs had changed the locks and controlled all communication. A direct approach risked triggering a defensive move, Ilara being whisked away to a facility. Atlas's solution was both simple and audacious. He exploited the building's one shared vulnerability, the antique mail chute system, a brass conduit that ran floor to floor, largely forgotten in the age of email. Maria determined that Ilara's apartment chute outlet was in a hall closet. Using a fiber optic camera, they confirmed it wasn't sealed. The first message was a test. A single braille card slipped down the chute from 2 floors above at 3 a.m. It read, "You are not alone. If you understand and want to talk, tap twice on the wall by your front door at noon tomorrow." It was a terrifying leap of faith. If Ilara was too scared, or if Riggs found the card, the operation was over. Atlas spent the morning pressed against the shared wall, listening through a specialized contact microphone. 11:59, silence. Noon, his heart hammered, then 2 distinct, soft but deliberate taps. Tap, tap. A wave of relief so profound it felt like pain washed over him. She was still in there and she was brave. Communication was established, but agonizingly slow. They developed a code. Taps for yes, a single scrape for no. Questions were written in braille and sent down the chute. Ilara's answers came back the same way on the back of the cards. She confirmed everything, the sale of her possessions, the intercepted mail, the threats of being moved. She also revealed a devastating new detail. Riggs was now pressuring her to sign a document, read aloud to her, that would grant Riggs power of attorney over any future legal matters. Ilara, terrified and blind, couldn't verify what she was signing. She refused so far, but the pressure was escalating. They had to move faster. While Naomi began her journalistic investigation, building the public narrative, Leo dove into the financial labyrinth. He followed the money from Ilara's sold Steinway. It was sold at auction for $85,000. The payment went into a conservatorship account controlled by Riggs, but Leo traced a subsequent transfer. $70,000 moved to a vendor for home safety modifications. The vendor was a shell company. Its bank account was emptied 2 days later. The funds dissipated through cryptocurrency, a classic laundering loop. But here where the story pivoted. While tracking this, Leo noticed anomalous payments in the guardianship files of other asterisk wards under Riggs's care. Not just asset sales, but regular, smaller debits. $20 a week for medication copays from a ward whose insurance covered everything. $50 a month for transportation fees for a bedridden patient. They were microtransactions designed to fly under the radar of annual audits. Leo estimated this fee creep was netting Riggs an extra $60,000 a year across all her wards. It was a revelation. The greed wasn't just for big scores, it was systemic, petty, and relentless. She was monetizing every facet of their dependence. Meanwhile, Naomi hit a wall. The probate court refused comment, citing privacy laws. The judges who oversaw Riggs's cases were inaccessible. The system was a closed loop, so she changed tactics. She used the financial trails Leo uncovered to approach the families of Riggs's other wards. These were sons, daughters, nieces, people who had legal standing but had often been sidelined by Riggs's claims of professionalism. One by one, they began to talk. A daughter who wasn't allowed to visit her father because she agitated him. A nephew who questioned the sale of a family home and was threatened with a restraining order. A pattern emerged not just of theft, but of deliberate family alienation, a strategy to remove oversight. Atlas now had allies with legal standing, but he needed irrefutable, admissible evidence. The shoot messages and his surveillance were legally toxic. They needed something clean. Maria devised the plan. They would use Riggs's own weapon, the impending fake audit, against her. They created a perfect forgery, an official-looking notice from the State Bureau of Guardianship Compliance, scheduling a random in-home well-being assessment for Ilara Vance. It gave 72 hours notice, as required by law. It was delivered by a process server to Riggs's office. Riggs took the bait. Panicked, she scrambled. Atlas's bugs in Ilara's apartment, planted during the building's fire alarm inspection, captured it all. They heard Riggs arrive with her staging crew again. But this time she also brought a doctor, a man named Dr. Evan Price, whose voice was calm, patronizing. He performed a cursory exam on Ilara, who was confused and frightened. Then, speaking clearly for the hidden microphone, he dictated notes to Riggs. Patient shows marked cognitive decline from last evaluation. Increased confusion, signs of clinical depression. Recommend review of current living situation, possibly transition to a higher care facility for her own safety. It was the fabrication Atlas had overheard her planning. Now they had it on tape. The conspiracy was recorded, but the recording also captured something else. As the doctor left Ilara, her voice trembling with a courage that stunned, Atlas spoke. "Dr. Price, you didn't test my cognition. You didn't ask me any questions. You're lying for her." There was a chilling silence. Then Riggs's voice, smooth as oil. "Now, Ilara, you're confused. That's what we're documenting. Don't make this harder than it has to be." They had their proof, a recorded conspiracy to commit fraud and medical malpractice. But as Naomi prepared her article and Leo compiled the financial evidence, Atlas made a critical decision. He wouldn't wait for publication. He would confront the corruption at its source directly. He used a shell company to request a private meeting with the presiding judge of the probate court that oversaw Riggs's cases, Judge Harold Winslow. The request cited potential financial malfeasance affecting a ward. The meeting was granted. Atlas walked into the judge's chambers, a room of dark wood and imposing law books. He presented a sanitized dossier, the public financial trails, the testimony from estranged family members, the pattern of asset sales. He presented it not as an accusation, but as a concerned citizen's inquiry. Judge Winslow, an elderly man with weary eyes, listened patiently. Then he set the folder down. "Mr. Kane," he said, "the guardianship system is overwhelmed. We rely on the integrity of appointed professionals. Ms. Riggs's annual reports are in order. These discrepancies, you note, are within the discretionary purview of a guardian managing complex care needs." Atlas pressed, "And the families being alienated, the rapid depletion of estates," the judge sighed. "Families are often emotional. Guardians make tough, unpopular decisions. The court reviews the numbers, not the relationships." It was a brick wall of bureaucratic inertia. The system was designed to trust its own appointees until presented with incontrovertible, courtroom-ready proof. The judge was not corrupt, he was complacent. A cog in a machine that had lost sight of the people it was built to serve. As Atlas left the courthouse, a cold realization settled over him. The legal system would move too slowly to save Ilara. By the time they navigated appeals and hearings, Riggs could have her declared incompetent and moved, and the money would be gone forever. The meeting had accomplished one thing, however. It had told him the official channels were a dead end. They had to go around them. He convened the team. "We accelerate. Naomi publishes in 48 hours. We coordinate with the families. The moment the story hits, they file simultaneous emergency petitions to remove Riggs as guardian, citing the article as evidence. We create a legal and media firestorm too big for one judge to ignore." But Riggs was not idle. She had sources. The day before the article was set to drop, Ilara's tapping through the wall changed. It was frantic, irregular. A new braille card came up the chute, written by a shaking hand. It read, "She is coming tomorrow with Dr. Price and papers. She says I am being transferred to Willowbrook facility at 10 a.m. for my safety. She says I have no choice. Help." Riggs was making her move. She was going to physically remove Ilara from the battlefield before the story could break. Willowbrook was a private care home 2 hours away, known for taking difficult patients. Once Ilara was behind those doors, communication would be impossible, and challenging the transfer would be a legal nightmare. Atlas's war was no longer about exposure. It was now a rescue mission. The timeline had collapsed. They had less than 18 hours to stop a lawful guardian from exercising her lawful authority to move her ward. Everything they had planned, the article, the petitions, would be too late. They needed to intervene directly, physically, in the moment of transfer, but interfering with a court-appointed guardian was a crime. It could mean arrest, lawsuits, and would discredit all their evidence. Atlas looked at his team. Maria understood first. "You want to be there when she tries to take her?" Atlas nodded. "We're not going to break the law, we're going to witness it. And we're going to give Ilara a voice so loud the whole world hears her say no." He turned to Naomi. "Change of plan, bring your camera. We're not just reporting the story anymore." He paused, the full weight of the decision in his voice. "We're going to broadcast it live." Diane Riggs did not arrive at 10 a.m. She came at 7:30, flanked by 2 uniformed private security guards and a man introduced as a patient transfer specialist. She had changed the game. The hallway outside Ilara's apartment became a stage. Naomi Vance, the journalist, was already positioned with a smartphone streaming live to a dedicated news channel her outlet had set up. The caption read, "Guardianship Removal, a Live Intervention." A few hundred viewers tuned in at first, curious. Atlas stood in his open doorway, a silent observer. Maria was downstairs in a van, monitoring police scanners. Leo was with the families of other wards, ready to file the emergency petitions the second the stream began. The plan was transparency as a shield, but Riggs was prepared for an audience. She carried a thick, official-looking binder. She ignored Naomi's camera completely, speaking directly to Ilara's closed door in a loud, performatively gentle voice. "Ilara, dear, it's time. The doctor and I are very concerned. We're taking you to a place where you can get the help you need. Please open the door, or we'll need to use the master key for your own safety." From inside, silence. Then Ilara's voice, clear and stronger than any of them had ever heard it through the wall. "I do not consent to this. I am not going with you." It was a simple, legal declaration. The power of those words, broadcast live, sent a ripple through the growing online viewership. Riggs's smile was thin. She nodded to the transfer specialist, who produced a key. "I'm afraid, due to your declining capacity, your consent is not legally required, Ilara. I have a court-affirmed duty to act in your best interest." This was the moment of violation, televised. The key turned. The door opened. Atlas moved. He stepped into the hallway, placing himself between Riggs and the open doorway. He didn't touch anyone. He simply stood, a formidable, immovable object. "Ms. Riggs," he said, his voice calm and cutting through the tension, "this woman has just verbally refused transport. On what specific, documented medical emergency are you busing this involuntary removal?" Riggs froze, seeing him for the first time. Recognition flickered in her eyes, not of him as a person, but as an obstacle. "Mr. Kane, this is a private guardianship matter. You have no standing. Interfere, and I will have these gentlemen remove you, and I will call the police for trespass and obstruction." Naomi pivoted the camera. "Ms. Riggs, Naomi Vance with the Chronicle. Is it standard procedure to use private security to remove a ward who is expressing a clear refusal? And can you comment on the allegations of financial mismanagement of Ilara Vance's estate, including the sale of her piano and the funneling of funds through shell companies?" The live viewer count spiked past 10,000. The comments scrolled, "This is kidnapping. Where are the police? Who is this billionaire?" Riggs paled. The publicity was a variable she hadn't fully calculated, but she was a bureaucratic warrior. She opened her binder. "I have here a signed order from the probate court, dated yesterday, authorizing temporary placement for evaluation based on sworn medical testimony of rapid decline. I also have a notarized inventory of all estate transactions, all approved by the court." She held up the documents to the camera. They looked impeccable. She had covered her tracks, using the very system designed to protect Ilara to sanction her removal. It was a checkmate move. She had paperwork. Atlas had suspicions and a live stream. In the eyes of the law arriving at that moment, she would win. But then came the pivot, the wait, it gets worse moment. It didn't come from Atlas, it came from inside the apartment. Ilara Vance, guided by the layout she knew by heart, appeared in the doorway. She was dressed, her dark glasses on, her posture straight. She held her own smartphone, its screen reader speaking at a rapid clip. She faced the general direction of the camera. "My name is Ilara Vance. Diane Riggs is my guardian. She has stolen from me. She has isolated me. She is trying to remove me from my home because I questioned her. The doctor who declared me incompetent, Evan Price, has been paid over $15,000 from my estate for consultations in the past year. I have never met him before yesterday." She took a breath. "And the Willowbrook facility has a corporate ownership link to a company managed by Diane Riggs's brother-in-law. This isn't care. This is a hostile takeover of my life." The hallway went utterly silent. Ilara had just articulated the entire conspiracy live. She had accessed the information Atlas's team had slipped to her via Braille and committed it to memory. She was no longer a passive victim, she was the star witness. The live stream exploded. Viewership hit 200,000. News outlets picked up the feed. The comments became a roar. Riggs's composure shattered. She's confused. She's parroting lies someone has fed her. But the damage was done. The transfer specialist took a step back, unwilling to touch a woman who was so clearly, eloquently fighting back on a national stage. Then the police arrived. 2 officers responding to a call about a disturbance. They assessed the scene, a crying blind woman, an angry guardian with security, a billionaire, a journalist on a live stream with hundreds of thousands watching. It was a tinderbox. Riggs pounced. She presented her court order. "Officers, I am this woman's legal guardian. This man," she pointed at Atlas, "is interfering. This journalist is trespassing. I need to execute this transfer order for my ward's safety." The older officer looked at the order, then at Ilara. "Ma'am, is that your guardian?" Ilara said, "Yes, and I am alleging she is abusing her position. I do not want to go with her." The officer rubbed his forehead. This was a civil nightmare. His job was to keep the peace and uphold court orders. The order in his hand was valid. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said to Ilara, his voice heavy. "If she's got the paper, we have to let her do her job. You'll have to take it up with the judge." A wave of despair hit Atlas. They had the truth, they had the audience, but the blue wall of procedure was about to let the crime happen anyway. The live stream captured Ilara's face crumbling. The public outrage was instantaneous and volcanic. But Maria in the van made the call. She activated the contingency. Across the city, the family members of Riggs's other wards, coordinated by Leo, simultaneously filed their emergency petitions in probate court. And they didn't just file them. They held a press conference on the courthouse steps, with Naomi's outlet streaming that, 3 sons, 2 daughters, and a niece, standing together, sharing nearly identical stories of alienation, asset stripping, and threats. The story was no longer about one blind woman. It was about a pattern, a predator operating within the law. The effect was electric. The officer's radio crackled. A sergeant, undoubtedly watching the feed, ordered a hold. "Do not facilitate the transport. Stand by. Command is consulting with the city attorney's office." A stalemate, but Riggs, cornered and desperate, made her fatal error. She pulled out her phone and made a call, turning away but not far enough. The sensitive microphone on Naomi's camera picked up her hissed words. "Harold, it's Diane. The situation is out of control. The Kane guy and a journalist are here. The Vance woman is refusing. I need you to call the precinct. Remind them of the standing order to assist court-appointed officers." "Yes, Judge Winslow. Now." The name dropped like a bomb. Judge Winslow, the presiding judge Atlas had met with. He wasn't just complacent. He was her safety net. He was the Harold she called to lean on the police. The corruption went higher than they imagined. It wasn't just one guardian exploiting the system. It was a guardian with a direct line to the judge who was supposed to be overseeing her. The live stream went supernova. A judge was now implicated. Viewer count shattered 1 million. News banners switched to breaking corruption allegations in probate court. The police officers, now aware their every move was being dissected by the world, completely froze. They would not touch this. Seeing her final play fail, Diane Riggs did the only thing left. She turned to her security. "Get me out of here." And she pushed past the cameras, down the hall, towards the elevator, abandoning the transfer, abandoning Ilara, in a frantic retreat from the spotlight she could no longer control. Ilara stood in her doorway, shaking but upright. Atlas remained, a silent sentinel. The police, relieved, said they would remain to secure the scene until things settled. The first battle was won. Ilara was, for the moment, safe in her home. But the war was just beginning, because by 9 a.m., Atlas Kane received a notification from his lawyer. Diane Riggs, through her attorney, had filed 3 lawsuits, one against Atlas for invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with a guardianship, one against Naomi Vance and her outlet for defamation and trespass, and one against Ilara Vance herself, petitioning the court for an immediate emergency hearing to declare her incapacitated and subject to malicious influence by third parties, seeking to have her removed from her apartment and placed in a secure medical facility, this time with a request to bar Atlas and Naomi from any contact. The paper war had begun. Riggs was using the legal system's infinite capacity for delay and defense to batter them into exhaustion. She had also, effectively, made Ilara a defendant in her own liberation. The cost of fighting this, financially and emotionally, would be staggering. Worse, Judge Harold Winslow, citing the media circus and potential conflict, recused himself from all of Riggs's cases. It sounded like a victory, but it was a tactical retreat. The cases were shuffled to another judge in the same circuit, a colleague. The system was closing ranks. Atlas looked at the lawsuits. He could afford the fight indefinitely, but Ilara couldn't. The process was the punishment. Then his head of security delivered the final piece of escalation. "We've detected surveillance on Miss Vance's building. Private investigators. They're digging into your background, sir, and they're looking for anything they can use on her, old medical records, anything to bolster their incapacity claim." Atlas understood. Riggs wasn't just defending. She was going on the offensive. She would attack Ilara's character, her mental state, and she would try to drag Atlas's reclusive, trauma-laden past into the light to discredit him as a vengeful, unstable billionaire. He had pulled Ilara from the fire, only to see her trapped in a labyrinth of lawsuits and character assassination. The public's attention would wane. The legal grind would wear them down. He had money and truth, but he was up against an entrenched system that knew how to outlast both. He needed a different kind of victory, not just to stop Riggs, but to shatter the model she represented. He needed to change the law, and to do that, he needed more than a live stream. He needed the one thing he had spent a decade avoiding, to step onto the public stage and become the story himself. The reclusive billionaire had to become the public champion. The stakes were no longer just Ilara's freedom. They were about every invisible person in the system. And to win, Atlas Kane would have to burn down the very walls he had built around himself. Atlas Kane's testimony before the State Senate Committee on Elder and Disability Rights was not broadcast on a live stream from a hallway, but on C-SPAN from a mahogany podium. For the first time, the reclusive billionaire spoke publicly, not about markets or technology, but about failure. His failure to act sooner, the system's failure to see. He presented the compiled evidence not as a plaintiff, but as a witness to a crime in plain sight. He methodically walked through the financial trails, the recorded medical fraud, the pattern across multiple wards. And then he introduced the committee to Ilara Vance. Ilara, seated beside him with her service dog, spoke without notes. She described the sound of her piano being taken away, the feeling of Braille messages slipped through a mail chute being her only lifeline, the terror of hearing a doctor lie about her mind. She concluded with a question that silenced the room. If a court order designed to protect can be used as a weapon to isolate, exploit, and silence, then who does the system serve, and who holds the guardians accountable? The effect was seismic. The live-streamed hallway confrontation had sparked outrage, but this dignified, devastating testimony before lawmakers sparked action. A bipartisan investigative subcommittee was formed that same afternoon. Subpoenas were issued for Diane Riggs's financial records and for the records of Judge Harold Winslow. The legal siege against Atlas and Elara began to crumble under this new scrutiny. Riggs's lawsuit against Elara for incapacity was the first to fall. The new judge assigned to the case, facing intense media and legislative pressure, appointed an independent medical examiner. The examiner, a neurologist specializing in adaptive living with visual impairment, spent 3 hours with Elara. Her report was unequivocal. Elara Vance possessed full cognitive capacity, excelled in orientation and mobility, and her only identifiable trauma was consistent with psychological abuse and coercion by a caregiver. The petition for incapacity was dismissed with prejudice. With that anchor gone, Riggs's other lawsuits lost their foundation. Her suit against Atlas and Naomi Vance for defamation hinged on the statements being false, but the evidence, the financial records, the taped conversation with Dr. Price, the testimony of other families, was now part of a formal Senate investigation. It was all verifiably true. Her lawyers advised her to settle. Atlas refused any settlement. He wanted the cases to go to trial, to discovery, where every document would become public record. Facing total exposure, Riggs dropped the lawsuits. But dropping the lawsuits did not stop the momentum. The Senate investigators, with subpoena power, went deeper than Leo ever could. They uncovered the network. The shell companies used to buy sold assets were traced to a web of offshore accounts ultimately controlled by a holding company. That company's sole director was Diane Riggs's brother-in-law. The patient transfer specialist who had come to Elara's door was a former bouncer with a restraining order history. Dr. Evan Price had his medical license suspended in another state for writing fraudulent prescriptions. And then the final shocking pivot that changed everything. Judge Harold Winslow was not just a passive enabler. The investigation found a pattern. Over the past 7 years, in over 80% of the cases where Diane Riggs petitioned for the sale of a major asset or for increased fees, Judge Winslow was the approving signatory. Furthermore, Winslow's campaign funds and a shadowy judicial education fund he controlled had received substantial donations from the very appraisers and realty firms that consistently won business from Riggs's wards' estates. It was a closed, corrupt ecosystem. The guardian, the judge, and the vendors were all feeding from the same vulnerable trough. Winslow resigned from the bench immediately. The State Judicial Conduct Commission opened disbarment proceedings. Diane Riggs was arrested on multiple felony counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, theft from a vulnerable adult, falsifying business records, and perjury. The district attorney, standing at a press conference flanked by the Senate committee chair, announced they were reviewing every single one of her 122 guardianship cases for evidence of fraud. The system, forced to look at itself, began a painful reform. The state passed Elara's law within 9 months. It mandated annual, in-person, unannounced visits by a court investigator to every person under guardianship. It created a public registry of guardians and their financial reports. It established a Bill of Rights for wards, including the right to independent counsel and the right to communication free from monitoring. Most importantly, it made family alienation a prima facie reason for guardian removal. The law wasn't perfect, but it replaced assumed trust with verified accountability. For Elara, the changes were personal and profound. The court removed Diane Riggs as her guardian. At Elara's request, and with Atlas's financial backing, a non-profit disability rights organization was appointed as her successor guardian. Their first act was to help her file a civil suit against Riggs, Winslow, and the affiliated companies for restitution. The case was settled for a confidential sum, but it was enough to guarantee Elara's financial independence for life. She moved out of the apartment that had been her prison. She bought a comfortable, accessible condominium with a room she turned into a music studio. With proceeds from her settlement, she commissioned a custom, tactile piano. She began composing again. But her greatest transformation was not behind a closed door. She became an advocate. She worked with the drafters of Elara's law. She spoke at conferences for disability rights attorneys. She started a foundation, funded by her settlement and a matching grant from Atlas, that provided free legal advocacy for people challenging abusive guardianships. The blind woman who had whispered for help through a wall was now helping rewrite the rules of the system that had failed her. And Atlas Kane, the man who had wanted walls between himself and the world, found he had built a bridge instead. He did not return to his former reclusion. He channeled his resources and his formidable strategic mind into systemic reform. He funded a national database to track guardianship cases and spot patterns of abuse. He backed political candidates who made elder and disability justice a pillar of their platforms. The tragedy that had once made him withdraw, the loss of his sister, now fueled his advocacy. He saw her in every vulnerable person failed by the system. The surprising detail, the final twist, came not from the investigation, but from an act of quiet humanity. After Ilara moved out, Atlas purchased the adjacent apartment, the one that had been her prison. He didn't move in. Instead, he had it renovated. He installed a state-of-the-art recording studio, soundproofed, with a Braille-annotated control panel. He gave the keys to Ilara's foundation. It became their headquarters and a free community studio for blind and low-vision musicians. The place where she had suffered was literally reborn as a place of creation and empowerment. The story that began with a desperate whisper ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the steady, unglamorous work of building something better. Atlas Kane did not just free one woman. He helped fracture a corrupt microeconomy and inspired a wave of accountability. Ilara Vance did not just escape her prison. She found her voice, and then she used it to amplify the voices of others still trapped in the silence. The battle was won. The war for dignity, however, is never truly over. It requires constant vigilance, the kind that doesn't wait for a cry through a wall, but that builds societies where such cries are never necessary. This is where their story pauses, not ends, on a note of hard-won hope and the understanding that justice is not a moment, but a commitment. So what does this story leave us with? Beyond the satisfying arc of rescue and reform, it leaves us with an uncomfortable mirror. The guardianship system, like many designed to protect the vulnerable, operates on a fundamental bargain. We trade some autonomy for promised safety. But as the case of Ilara Vance reveals, that safety is only as reliable as the transparency and accountability we build into the system. When oversight is an afterthought, protection can become predation. At its core, this is a story about proximity and attention. The crime happened not in a shadowy alley, but in a luxury apartment. The evidence was not a hidden document, but a pattern of everyday cruelty overheard through a wall. Atlas Kane was not a superhero. He was a neighbor who finally chose to listen, and then refused to accept the explanation that what he was hearing was none of his business. That is the lingering question this documentary leaves at your door. How many such walls exist in our world? Not just physical walls, but walls of bureaucracy, of privacy laws twisted into shields, of our own uncomfortable willingness to look away from complex, painful problems. The Diane Riggs of the world depend on those walls. They depend on the assumption that no one will look too closely, that no one will connect the dots, that no one will be brave enough or stubborn enough to ask the difficult questions in the face of official paperwork. Ilara and Atlas's story is a blueprint, not a fantasy. It shows that change begins when evidence meets courage, and when courage is amplified by strategy. It proves that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged when light is shone in the right places. But that light doesn't switch on by itself. It requires our collective willingness to pay attention, to question, and to care about the invisible struggles happening in plain sight. The work continues. Ilara's foundation advocates for new wards every day. Reforms inspired by her case are being debated in other states. The conversation has shifted from whether there's a problem to how we can build better solutions. That is the real victory, not just a life reclaimed, but a system recalibrated toward its original purpose, genuine care. If this story resonated with you, consider it more than a tale. Consider it a call to a different kind of attention. Look closer at the world immediately around you. Listen, ask questions, because sometimes justice isn't about a dramatic rescue from afar. Sometimes it's about hearing a whisper through a wall and deciding firmly that it is your business after all. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more deep dives into the systems that shape our lives and the people who change them, make sure to subscribe. Your attention is the first, most powerful tool for change.